Back in 1969, the Youngbloods had a hit with a song called Get Together. It was really a good hit. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and the song and the way that the fellow sang it and so forth was just excellent. But the lyrics start off, love is but a song we sing, fear's the way we die. You can make mountain rings or make the angels cry, though the bird is on the wing and you may not know why. Come on, people now, smile on your brother. Everybody get together, try to love one another right now. Some may come and some may go. He will surely pass, when the one that left us here returns for us at last. We are but a moment's sunlight fading on the grass. Come on, people now, smile on your brother. Try to get together. Try to love one another right now. If you hear the song I sing, you will understand. Listen, you hold the key to love and fear all in your trembling hand. Just one key unlocks them both. It's here at your command. Come on, people now, smile on your brother. Everybody get together. Try to love one another right now. The song was written by a fellow named Chet Powers, and back in the mid 60s. It was originally recorded by the Kingston Trio. And if you like folk music, sort of, it's on one of their albums. But this one was released by the Youngbloods in '67, and it only got up to about 60 on the chart, and then released in '69 and became a pretty big hit. But you know, it was kind of typical, I think, of the songs back in those days. This became sort of the anthem for the peace movement to some degree, although there were some other songs. But we had a lot of songs trying to put down war and build up love. Part of the problem, though, was that it didn't really talk about what love is and how to love. It was very sentimental. It didn't really address why we have war, why we have violence, and why we fail to get together and love one another. It just ends up being sort of a feel-good song about a feel-good topic. I mean, it was easy to write songs back then about how bad people were and how good we should be and so forth, but in reality, it doesn't really go anywhere, because you see, that was back in the 60s, and we still got the same problems today. Not loving, though, is a problem, isn't it? And we humans are good at not loving. We really are. The Corinthians were good at doing anything that demonstrated their lack of love. They really were. And that's why we're going to focus upon a chapter that Paul gives us that helps us to see what love is all about. They may not have actively hated each other, the Corinthians, but they just put their own interests first. And when you do that, that means you run over each other. That means you sidestep each other. That means you ignore each other. That means you say things in order to get your way that might hurt. It means you do things in order to get your way that might hurt. You don't care because you're more concerned about what you get out of this. And so while they may not have actively hated each other, they sure did a pretty good job, though, of letting their disdain be known. And so Paul writes a chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, that's become a very famous chapter. But oftentimes, though, we don't really take it in context, because now, you understand what I'm going to say here. A lot of times we read 1 Corinthians 13, or at least parts of it, at a wedding. And it should be. I mean, Paul's chapter on love and what love is appropriate at any time, and especially for two people getting married. One of the things, though, that I've always thought about is what people don't understand is that generally people get married because they fall in love with each other. They have this passion for each other. But yet 1 Corinthians 13 isn't about passion. It isn't about the feeling. It is about an action. It is about being deliberate in how you treat others. And oftentimes that's what some married folk don't understand is that they go in this marriage with this feel-good relationship, and then they start finding out that their mate doesn't quite act the way that they want them to, and then what do? Well, when you look at the Corinthian church, first of all, there were a lot of divisions going on. I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Christ. They even made Jesus one of their divisions. Although since Paul later on does say that divisions are necessary to show who's authentic among you, so maybe the I'm of Christ group was the real thing. I don't know, but it kind of seems that they were dividing up according to various individuals, and they were in rival groups. Who knows, when you went to the assembly, were they all sitting in their various groups? I'm sure that in some churches today that you might even find that. I don't know. But look at some of the things they do, and I'll bring this up again. They had lawsuits against each other. They visited temple prostitutes. They were eating meat in front of the weak brothers. Now, eating meat sacrificed to idols. Now, I know I don't really have time to go into that, but when Paul says, if it will offend my brother, I won't eat meat, he's not talking about the way we think of the word of being offended today. He's talking about causing them to stumble. So if I chow down on meat and a brother sees me doing that and then is emboldened to eat that meat too, and then that draws them back into the pagan lifestyle, into idolatry, then I've not acted in love. And so they would eat meat in front of their weak brothers and say, ha, 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 look at me. I get to do what I want to do, and you can't tell me what to do. We also see the well-to-do eating all the potluck before everybody else arrives, particularly the not-so-well-to-do. And Paul says you end up shaming them, because here they are coming, and they might just have a small little offering, and instead of it being this great meal, they've just got this little bit. They also were showing off what they thought was the best gift, tongues. Now, I know that some think that tongues here, relates to this language of angels and so forth. But, the Corinthians wouldn't have been attracted to that. They would have been attracted to something that people really knew was in language. Really knew was something real. And what I mean by that is that if you could actually speak a foreign language that you didn't know, and other people in the church, even though they didn't really know the language, they could recognize it, and they knew that you didn't know it, and all of a sudden here you are miraculously speaking to the congregation in that language. Wow. And so they would walk around, I'm pretty tough. I'm pretty cool. Look at the gift I got. So Paul needs to define their relationship in a way that will help them get together and smile on their brother. Somebody once said, to live above with those we love, oh, how that would be glory. To live below with those we know, now that's another story. And that's so true. You see, what Paul wants to do is to help the Corinthians see that there's a certain way that they ought to be engaging one another. There's a certain way that they ought to help each other. There's a certain way in which they ought to put each other first in order to make their congregation work as it should. Now, Paul really starts off in chapter 8 to introduce what love is all about. And he says, now concerning things sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge makes arrogant or puffs up, but love edifies. So knowledge makes you arrogant, but love edifies. If anyone supposes that he knows anything, he is not yet known as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by him. Why? Because God is love. That's what God wants from us. And so instead of having these rivalries that were going on, Paul says that, instead of charting out your knowledge, trotting out your knowledge in order to show off one another and to win arguments, why not edify each other? Why not help each other understand? And why not help each other through this situation? So again, getting back to the eating meat sacrificed to idols. Now, Paul says, yeah, we know that it's just idols behind there. There's nothing to the idols. And there's nothing to the meat sacrificed to the idols. There's nothing about that. But not everybody knows that. And if you go around saying, well, hey, I can just live the way that I want to and eat what I want to, then you're not helpful to those who can't do that. And so Paul says, rather you edify, you lift people up rather than puff yourself up. And actually, when you read through Corinthians, somebody has sort of said that knowledge puffs up, and Paul shows that in chapters 8, 9, and 10, when he shows how the Corinthians react to one another. But then he says love edifies in 12, 13, and 14, because 12 and 14 are chapters about how they use their gifts and how they react in the assembly, and love is sort of sandwiched in between. The chapter on love really isn't meant to be read at a wedding. It was meant to be read at business meetings. It was meant to be read in churches where people don't get along. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole chapter in 13, but I do want to kind of put a couple of things in context. Paul starts off by saying, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, and if I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries, and if I have faith so as to move all mountains, and if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it's worthless. Paul pictures the necessity of love because we want to do great things. We want to help. We want to do things that look good and so forth. But Paul says you have to put them into a context. If you're doing all of this and love isn't the motivating mindset, it isn't the core of how you control that and so forth, then it's not going to do you any good. He then goes on in verses 4 through 7 and describes the character of love. And he tells us what love is and what love isn't, and then how love will always behave. And then in verses 8 through the end, he tells us that love never fails. Now, even though I'm not going to go into it, I really think that 8 through 13 isn't about the completed New Testament, that it's really about love as the mature and perfected attitude that we ought to have. And Paul's trying to show them that the things that they're being arrogant about, their gifts and so forth, and their knowledge and their understanding, it's really worthless without love. And to be what really perfects you and what really makes you mature is love and not these things. But let's look at, first of all, what Paul says about what love is. He says, love is patient and love is kind. Patient. Patient means controlling your anger and maintaining proper character. Now, the Corinthians weren't doing this with their lawsuits. For some reason or other, they were overreacting to each other. Who knows what brought that up? But can you imagine, your brother wrongs you, and the first thing you do is you take him to court. Now, here in America, of course, that wouldn't fly. But back then, apparently that's the thing that they did. They went to court over things like this. Being patient means that things happen to me, and I control my anger. I don't let anger get a hold of me. I don't let anger come in contact with me. And I've really noticed, I'm not in danger of this, so don't worry about this, but I have noticed that I'm a little more frustrated with people in their driving habits here of late. I don't know why that is. And because I know better than that. I know that I'm not perfect in my driving. I know that I'm not, that sometimes I, miss the things that I should. Fortunately, it's never, come out around big. But there are some people, though, that really just let the rage build up in them. And unfortunately, what happens is that when they let that do that, it starts here and it builds and it builds and it builds and it builds until finally somebody does something and they explode. I remember up in New Jersey. I was driving along, and all of a sudden, I see this car coming behind me, and he's zipping around, in between there. I think it was a 3-lane highway, and he's zipping around, and he comes around me, and then he pulls around the car in front of me and pulls in front of that car and slows down. Well, actually, he pulls side by side, and he tries to move it over, but the guy's not doing it. So he moves in front, and finally he stops right in front of the car, and there's so much traffic on the other side that the car is forced to stop. And as I drive by, the guy hops out, and he's waving some kind of a badge of some kind. And there's an older man in there. And see, I can say this now because probably he was my age then than I am now. But anyway, apparently, and this guy was yelling and screaming at him, and man, he was out of control. He was not patient. He did not control his anger, and he didn't maintain proper character. And this will come up for something else here in a minute as well. Paul says love is also kind. Kind is we know what kind is. It's where you act and behave towards somebody in ways that they need and to help them out. And I missed the opportunity the other day to act in kindness. I'm at the doctor's office, and I'm kind of lost in my thinking, and I'm on, looking at my phone and so forth. And a lady walks out of, sort of the exam area there, and she's got a walker. And, I'm thinking she's going to stop at the desk, so I stop, so I don't get up to do anything. And all of a sudden, she's opening the door, and I could have hopped up and held the door for her. That would have been an act of kindness. Kindness is something we do in words and in action. We say kind things, and we do kind things. There's a CEO, I won't tell you who he is, just in case the story isn't true, because I did spend the time looking it up. But apparently there was a CEO today, a very rich man, who when he was 10 years old, he was at his grandparents' house, and he saw a commercial stating that every puff a smoker took on a cigarette shortened his life by 2 minutes. And so he was apparently quite the math whiz, and so he began adding up the minutes that a longtime smoker like his grandmother had lost to cigarettes. Of course, to his surprise, his grandmother started crying when he announced that she had lost 16 years of her life to smoking. Granddad took him aside for a talking to, and to the young man's surprise, his grandfather wasn't angry, nor did he attempt to punish him. He simply said, "You'll learn one day that it's much harder to be kind than to be clever." Oh, to be kind in everything that we say and do. Paul then switches to what love isn't. I think sometimes, in defining what it is, we also need to define what it isn't. Paul says, love is not jealous. I think other translations say envy. The Corinthians had this rivalry going on, and why, I don't know. Well, yeah, I do know, because that's the way we humans are. I know of a song leader, I know of a congregation where song leaders actually sort of count up the number of times they're asked to lead singing and compare each other at the end. And if it's not, equal, then such is the way things go sometimes. But then Paul says love is also not arrogant or does not brag. Bragging is a desire for attention, and that's probably where the jealousy and envy comes from. Somebody else gets attention, and so you want attention too. So you start bragging. You want the adoration of others, and you exaggerate maybe about yourself and so forth. I read about there was a man who was hired by a rather large university to be their head coach. He had done a marvelous job in some smaller universities, and it turned out he had lied on his resume about things he had done and his degrees and and his football experience and so forth. And for those, it didn't matter. They didn't really look at his past, but this big university did, and it got him thrown out. So here he was bragging and wanting attention, and unfortunately it caught up with him. And then, of course, Paul says love is also not arrogant. And that sort of goes with bragging, because it means you're conceited. You have this self-admiration going on, and it ends up making you stupid. There was a 19-year-old young lady here recently in Nebraska who went into a bank with a gun. Well, she claimed she had a gun. She gave them a note. She was masked, of course, and demanded money and all of this. And then after she got it, she took off. And then in the same clothes, she's with her phone on YouTube making a video saying how she robbed this bank and how she's going to get back at the government for stealing her baby from her. And she's going to buy a brand new car and clothes. And she's just bragging about it. And she's very arrogant. And you see, arrogance makes you do stupid things. Paul then says something interesting. He says, does not act unbecomingly. Back to the car rage that I was talking about earlier. Here's some fellow. He's a young guy. Looked like he was in, at the time, I think I was probably in my early 40s. And he looked not that much younger than I. And here he is, of course, trying to run Grandpa off the road. And he's up and yelling. He's waving some kind of a badge. I couldn't see what it was. He had something in his hand. But that's acting unbecomingly. Here he is mad and so forth. Why not just write down the guy's license plate and go talk to the police? He said, you might want to check out this guy. But here he is, acting in such an arrogant way and a stupid way, and that's unbecoming. Paul says that love does not seek its own. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Love doesn't seek its own. It seeks what others need, not what you need. There's a story about an Arctic explorer. And he was writing about something that happened. He said one night in an emergency hut, he was trying to sleep, and so with this man, and he had just rationed out the last biscuits. There was nothing left. Of course, obviously, since he's writing about this later, they were rescued. But anyway, every man appeared to be asleep, and the head of this sensed a movement, and he opened his eyes and turned around and saw one of his men turning to see how the others were doing. He obviously thought that they were asleep too. So he stretched out over the next man and took his biscuit bag, and then he removed the biscuit. And the head of this exploration was dumbfounded. He thought he could trust this man with his life, and here he was stealing another man's biscuit. Had the pressure, turned on him and made him into a thief, a betrayer, and one who was seeking his own rather than others. Then he saw them move again, and he removed the biscuit from his own bag and put both biscuits back into the other man's bag, quietly returned the bag to his sleeping friend's side, and went back to sleep. You see, love doesn't seek its own. It seeks others, even when you're in the most dangerous of situations. Love doesn't keep track doesn't take into account wrong suffered. It doesn't keep track of what happens to me. It's kind of easy to see those things. And it's easy to keep track of it. I have a list, but I'm on somebody else's list too. So, and then of course Paul says love doesn't rejoice in unrighteousness. Look at the Corinthians. They were proclaiming their freedom and their liberty in Christ by visiting prostitutes. Paul ends with what love will always do. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Now the word bears really means to cover, and I think it's speaking about protecting. Protects, and then believes, trusts, hopes, wants the best, and endures, doesn't give up. In other words, holds their ground. So love will cover others, protect them, will believe and trust in them until they're forced not to, will always hope for the best, and will never give up their ground. And then Paul says, love never fails. Interesting that the word that Paul used there speaks about falling, and some think he's talking about falling to the ground. That's what happens when a soldier or a boxer goes down, is they fall to the ground. He says love never does that. Love never gives up. So in short, love is the controlling mindset for all that I do, for all that I say. It tells me what to do and it tells me what not to do. It demands that I respond in a thoughtful way that doesn't hurt or harm others, either emotionally or physically. It demands that I put others' well-being above my own selfish needs. This young father writes that he and his kids were going shopping. His daughter Helen is 8, Brandon's 5. And as they pull up, they're in the parking lot of the mall where they're going. There's a big, there's a little bit of a petting zoo that has popped up. And as they're going by, and this must have been quite some years ago, he tossed each kid a quarter and said, go and have fun. So as he's walking in to the mall, he turns around and there's his daughter following him. And he said, Helen, what's going on? Why are you here? Why aren't you at the petting zoo? And she says, well, Daddy, it cost 50 cents. So I gave Brandon my quarter. Then she said, and the most beautiful thing I've heard, the family motto is love in action. Well, she gave Brandon a quarter, and no one loves cuddly, furry creatures more than Helen. So anyway, we go back after I finished my errands, and he says, I took Helen back to the petting zoo. We stood by the fence and watched Brendan go crazy, petting and feeding the animals. Helen stood with her hands and chin resting on the fence and just watched Brandon. I, the father says, had 50 cents burning a hole in my pocket. I never offered it to Helen, and she never asked for it, because she knew the whole family motto. It's not love in action. It's love is sacrificial action. Love always pays a price. Love always costs something. Love is expensive. When you love, benefits accrue to another's account. Love is for you, not for me. Love gives, it doesn't grab. Helen gave her quarter to Brandon and wanted to follow through with her lesson. And she learned that love is sacrificial action. And so you see, love is not a feeling. It's not a warm fuzzy. It's not a feel-good song. Love is the way we live our life. It's putting others first, or it's at least taking the time to consider what somebody else needs before me and how I should respond. So Paul says the fruit of the Spirit is love. So you see, love, act loving, and the Spirit will help you develop the fruit called love. God bless.